Hi everybody, Professor Charlie Collins here, and today I will be giving you a brief introduction to liberation psychology. We will be talking more about this later on in the quarter, but I want to give you just a brief introduction, particularly because we're talking about international psychology, and out of all the different ideas that have been generated internationally from an international community psychology, psychology is probably the closest connected and the place where we've um, had a closer relationship and has integrated its way into community psychology. I would say more so than many of the other ideas in psychology, in international psychology. And so today we'll be first talking about the context of liberation psychology. How did it come about? Defining liberation psychology, some of the elements of liberation psychology, and the ways in which liberation psychology has found its way into community psychology. And so liberation psychology really started in the early to mid 20th century in Latin America, so Central and South America. And it really emerged out of a way to understand systemic oppression and really particularly colonialism. So as the Western powers, and particularly the United States, as they were invading and establishing various dictatorships and corporations, and creating things like the Banana Republic. Look into the Banana Republic. In Latin America, the local indigenous people were trying to figure out ways to understand what was going on. And so educators like Paulo Freire in Brazil and Ignacio Martin Boró, who sort of moved around Latin America and eventually ended up assassinated in El Salvador. These are the two sort of main figures of a liberation psychology. And you've probably read, if you've had BIS 300, you've probably read Pedagogy of the Oppressed, or something similar to it. And so community psychology borrows a lot from liberation psychology. And so that's the sort of context and etiology of liberation psychology. And so let's think about how to define a liberation psychology. So Vargas Diaz and Serrano Garcia give a good definition of liberation psychology. And so I'll just quote this. And they say, liberation psychology is attempts to work with people, taking their social context into account to enhance their awareness of oppressive situations and ideologies. And so really what a liberation psychology does is it seeks to examine asymmetrical power relationships between people who are oppressed and people who are oppressing them, or systems that are oppressing them, right? And the way that oppression usually works and asymmetrical power relations usually work are through institutions. And so the justice system, policing, education, so on and so forth, are ways in which asymmetrical power relations manifest and how power is created, right? And so what liberation psychology seeks to do is build individual and collective agency to address these issues, right? To address asymmetric power relations and try to really understand the role that individuals have and groups have in creating those asymmetrical power relationships, and also building the capacity to try to subvert them, try to undo them. And so there's various elements of a liberation psychology. So critical analysis, reflection, awareness, capacity, and action. And so let's jump into each of these. So a critical analysis is really an analysis of oppressive situations and asymmetric power relationships, right? So it's analyzing the ways that power manifests and how power is created and how power can be undermined. It's also analyzing one's own understanding of that, right? And so when we talk about a liberation psychology, we're really talking about the ways in which these asymmetric power relationships have manifested psychologically for us, right? So for both the oppressed, but also new research is coming out to look at one's own psychology from dominant groups as well. So a lot of my work, for example, on whiteness is really looking at how domination manifests in a psychological sense, right? And so it's analyzing those components. Critical reflection is really about reflecting on one's own role within oppressive systems and reflecting on the ways in which it manifests psychologically and how to potentially undo those. Critical awareness is the becoming aware and becoming to understand the historic and contemporary configurations of oppression, right? And the ways in which systems oppress individuals. Critical capacity moves to one's own individual knowledge and understanding and skills to take action to undo both the material and psychological manifestations of oppression. And then critical action is taking action to do those things, taking the steps to liberate oneself psychologically and materially, oneself and one's group from psychologically and materially from oppressive situations. And so the ways that liberation psychology has found its way into community psychology is really through two main constructs, two main ideas that we have in community psychology. One is empowerment, the other is critical consciousness. And critical consciousness is related closely to what Paulo Freire talked about in Pedagogy of the Oppressed. And we'll read a lot about empowerment, and empowerment is a real key guiding framework within community psychology. And we'll talk about that more later, so I'm not going to get into the details of it. But empowerment is really about how one gains power or gains agency within one's own life. And so that gaining of agency, that gaining of power has to do with some of that critical analysis and that reflection that liberation psychology talks about, and the analysis of oppressive situations. And critical consciousness is also a key framework in community psychology, and really is just directly liberation psychology. So those are the main ideas within liberation psychology. Again, this is just a touch on liberation psychology. We'll dig deeper into it as the quarter goes. But this is one really key framework in an international community psychology that has found its way into really US community psychology.